This is Bulletstorm VR, the VR version of the 2011 shooter that received some decent praise upon its initial release thanks to its fast-paced and frenetic action. This released January 18th, 2024 for the PSVR 2, PCVR, and Quest 2 end-up headsets for $40 US, and for this review, we checked out the game on the PSVR 2 and Quest 3. I've always said that VR makes just about any flat game better, and then there's Bulletstorm VR. Before we get to it, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave us a comment with your thoughts on this release. I'm Ryan for the VR Grid, now let's do this. First off, I never played Bulletstorm before this release, as the original dropped at a time when some big games, like Skyrim and Arkham City, already had my full attention, so I was looking forward to diving into this VR version, as it felt like a way to check out a classic game I missed, while seeing just how much VR can make it better. Sadly, what's on offer here has me questioning why this game got any praise in the first place. Right off the hop, you're treated to a few cutscenes that break down the story about revenge as you, in the role of a space mercenary, not a regular one, a space one, named Grayson, who has been betrayed by your commander, not a space commander, just a regular one, and so your quest begins to blah blah blah. It doesn't really matter as the plot here is largely nonsensical. My issues with the lack of story are the least of this game's seemingly endless problems, with one of the main ones being that quite literally every character in here is an unlikable asshole. I'll touch on this more in a bit, but when you don't care at all about your hero's plight, it tends to make for a tedious journey. Regardless, once you get to enemies, things should just get better, as even a mindless shooter can still be fun, but this is anything but that. Before you get your incredibly overpowered tether, you were stuck with just your machine gun, which was my first true sign that I was in for a slog of a game. Enemies just straight up don't react to your bullets and behave in one of two ways: running towards you for melee attacks, or taking cover and shooting from a distance. There is an option to toggle gore in the settings, but even with it turned on, the only real gore I saw was when heads disappeared, or bodies were dismembered with nary a blood splatter in sight. Said tether should make things a bit better, and maybe for the first few minutes it did, as with it you can grab at foes and yank them toward you, causing them to float helplessly in the air as you shoot at them or kick them into various environmental hazards that reward you with points you can spend on upgrading weapons. You can kick them off cliffs, into cacti, bug swarms, pits, electric cables, grinders, and so on, and while that sounds fun on paper, in practice it gets quite old quite fast. The range in the tether is large, and regardless of what's in their way, once you grab someone, they fly toward you, traveling through objects in the environment and making it feel incredibly cheap, but necessary, as the combat is clearly designed around this tether. Most of the weapons have a charge mode that lets you unleash intense bursts of firepower, but the game rarely requires it thanks to just how easy almost every encounter is. 2 new levels were added to this VR version, where you play as Trishka, who is armed with what are essentially wrist-mounted lightsabers that are even more overpowered than the tether, as they are able to kill almost any foe in one swipe. While I played through the first stage with her taking my time, my second turn with the character had me sprinting through the stage waving my hands as foes just ran into the blades. In fact, I played through the latter half of this game the same way, just with guns, as I just wanted to get through this 5-hour story as fast as I could. Immersion is arguably the most important factor when making a VR game, so why the developer decided to display controller prompts over almost every interactable item is kind of insane. I get in the opening stage when the game teaches you to kick or tether obstacles in your way, but when I'm 4 hours deep into a story and still seeing huge floating controller icons telling me to pull a lever I've seen 30 times before that point, it just feels like the developers have no faith in their game design. Sniping is a mixed bag, as bringing the rifle to your face turns your entire vision into a scope, which I dislike, but as your bullet approaches a target, you can steer it with your head, which I did like, for a more accurate shot, which is necessary as for some reason, enemies will always see your bullet coming and try and jump out of the way. Throw in some climbing sections where your hands don't actually grab what they're holding, some on-the-rails minigun sections where, thanks to impact physics on your guns, had my gun flailing in all directions but my targets, constant fade to black load screens that seem quite unnecessary, and you are left with a VR game with some weak bones that aren't made any better by the actual presentation. I dabbled with this in the Quest 3, and it looks like a Gen 1 Quest game with dialed back textures on nearly everything that make it look quite unappealing, though the game plays the same. I foolishly expected a substantial upgrade on the PSVR 2 version, and while it is improved compared to the standalone headset, that bar really couldn't be much lower. With a resolution only slightly better than the PSVR 1, nearly everything is muddy looking, with enemy and environment textures looking at best serviceable and at worst, missing. I get that this is a 13-year-old game, but there's no excuse for this to look this bad in the headset. Popping is rampant, and not just on faraway stuff, but on items right next to you. Nearly everything is a shade of brown or gray, making the entirety of this game look bland and unappealing. There are hints of dynamic lighting during some sections of the game, but for most of it, shadows are static and blend in so well with your surroundings that even they look missing. Reprojection on the PSVR 2 makes everything look even worse, making for an overall ugly experience. There are a few visually fun moments, like the opening stage where you are walking down the side of a building, or those rail shooter sections, but for the most part, this just isn't a good looking game. Where its visuals falter, the audio design outright fails, both intentionally and not. I get the whole bro homie mentality, and it works in some cases, but here, it just makes every character unrelatable, irritating, and not very heroic. Every person in this game is unlikable, and feels like they were written by 10-year-old boys who just discovered the Urban Dictionary 1980s edition, giving this some of the poorest dialogue I've heard in all of my gaming life, which is sad, as it features some solid actors. The most relatable person in here is a soldier being taken over by an AI program, and that's only because he's struggling with something. The rest are just angry for anger's sake. Spatial audio is here, but not implemented well, and I often heard enemies yelling, they always yell, from left or right, but it was never easy to pinpoint exactly where they were coming from. Whenever the next encounter was triggered, a generic rock track would abruptly kick in, and just as quickly cut out when all the baddies were killed, only to have it kick in and out again as one or two more savages showed up, making it laughable at times.
Damn it!
Not a bad thing. They won't be focused.
They're gonna be. Only way out of here.
I'm trying to keep this relatively short, as I could honestly rant about just how much is wrong with this game for probably a good hour. Even if all the technical foibles were addressed, I forgot to mention the menu options that don't work. That still leaves a VR game that doesn't look great, is way too easy, incredibly monotonous, immature, with an irrelevant story and unlikable characters. If this was $20, I'd still be hard pressed to recommend this to anyone, but considering it's double that, has me warning all of you to stay far, far away from this broken and boring game. I'm gonna give Bulletstorm VR an 8 out of, just kidding. I actually hate this game. I'm giving this a 3 out of 10, and that's mostly for the fun set pieces. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to do the YouTube things to help us out. And that's it for this one. Thank you so much for watching.